Welcome Mr. Horowitz and ask him to present his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this hearing, there's been much focus, and rightly so, on the conduct and evils committed by the government of China and by the government of North Korea. What I hope to provide is, and what I think is very much called for, is further thought on how to make those protests, how to make those complaints more effective in ways that reach China. My own experience with China, and I think you will confirm it, Mr. Chairman, is that it is in many ways the least ideological country in the world. It's all an issue of cost and gain. And there are ways of imposing costs on China for its conduct towards these refugees that I think need exploration. Let me set out some that I think will be the most effective. The first is really to thank you, Mr. Smith, and colleagues like Congressman Wolf, Congressman Royce, who live and die these human rights issues. I wish there were more of you in Congress. This is an occasion to lament the death of Tom Lantos. I think had he been alive, Congress would have spoken on a bipartisan basis and much more clearly. And former colleagues like Tony Hall are as well deeply, deeply missed in not having made this a much more bipartisan issue than it ought to be. I do hope in that regard that we can reach Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, because when she was a mere member of Congress, her voice was one of the loudest and clearest and bravest on human rights violations by the Chinese government. And if somehow Minority Leader and former Speaker Pelosi can regain that voice, I think China will sit up and listen, because there really will be a bipartisan coalition. So reaching Nancy Pelosi seems to me one way of rescuing these 33 people and changing China's policies. And in the Senate, we need to make up for the loss of Sam Brownback and Evan Bayh, who spoke so clearly on a bipartisan basis. And I'm hoping that Senator Brown, that Senator Rubio, that others join, and that we have this kind of bipartisan strength that China will recognize and respond to. The second, and it's been mentioned, is the Korean American community. I've spent the last 5 years trying to engage that community, as the Jewish community was engaged on the campaign for Soviet Jewry, as the African American community was engaged on the campaign against the apartheid regime. I am absolutely convinced that in this nation of immigrants, which always hears the cries of Americans who speak of the torture of their brothers and sisters in their home countries, that the Korean American community, unbeknownst to itself, has the power to change China's mind and shift American policy and create a paradigm shift on China's part and in the treatment of these refugees. Let me put it this way. Neither the Democratic nor the Republican Party would be willing for a second, no matter what China's pressures would be, to risk the loss of the votes in support of the Korean American community over the next 25 or 30 years. And if the leadership of the Korean American community makes this a signature issue, the murder of their brothers and sisters, and we have ways of reaching that community, as Scoop Jackson reached a reluctant Jewish community. So there's another leadership role for this commission and for you again, Mr. Chairman. I would have members of Congress call in the leaders, the church leaders of the Korean American community, as Scoop Jackson called the leaders of the Jewish community, and tell them to have a prayer Sunday for North Korea at 3,000 Korean American churches with voter registration booths outside the churches. That will change things dramatically within the administration, and China will see that it cannot use the business community, it cannot leverage the political community, because America will listen to an aroused, engaged Korean American community, which has not yet happened. Third, of course, the administration, and it's been mentioned. Food aid should be distributed on a needs basis, and this new deal that was made has got to be made where we really pay careful attention to the fair distribution of the food on a needs basis. But the core of it all, and it's a problem of both this administration and the prior one, is the lack of a Helsinki strategy approach to dealing with China and on North Korea issues. We put a Helsinki strategy would, as Suzanne and others have said, put human rights issues right in the basket of things that were negotiated, that are negotiated as we talk of all weapons issues with North Korea. It has been relegated to a so-called second track. Where the Chinese get it, it doesn't matter. And whenever an American official speaks, as the Vice President did during the Xi visit, the Chinese understand that that's for domestic political consumption, and it doesn't really reflect the policy of the United States to prioritize issues of human rights. Let me say Ronald Reagan understood that. And you know why, I think, Mr. Chairman? Because he had been president of a union. I think if we had the AFL-CIO replacing the State Department in these negotiations, there would be this understanding that raising human rights issues is important not only for moral reasons, but it would make us far more powerful on the weapons issues, where we offer and sell the same product and get the same promises and give money and get no response, as will be the case this time, and why any union negotiator would understand that if the only thing on our table is the weapons issues, we are signaling to China and to North Korea, you got something we want, how much do we have to pay you for it? All the leverage goes on the other side. Anybody from the Teamsters Union would get it in a second, Mr. Chairman, and that's what we need. The kind of shrewdness in bargaining that I find lacking here, and the power of a Helsinki strategy. And from that follows, and I want to get specific about the 33, Bob King is a very decent, caring man who is our special envoy for North Korean human rights. But as I've said, he's on the second track. It's so low as not to count, really. And the Chinese take Bob King's assignment as the negotiator for the 33, I fear, as a signal that they can deport those 33 and nothing will happen to U.S.-China relations. We need to get, and I hope this commission will ensure that the Secretary becomes engaged in that negotiation over the lives of those 33 and the others, because that's the signal that this administration has not sent and needs to send. And finally, I think Michael Posner, a friend and a good man, needs to throw around his weight a little bit more and pound his shoe on the table, because he's been ignored, as Frank Wolf pointed out at the last hearing over the Xi visit. And I think Michael needs to seriously indicate to his colleagues in the State Department that he's ready to resign if those 33 are deported. I think he has a moral obligation to resign, frankly, if any of those 33 are sent to death camps, and if this administration sends the kind of low-interest, low-priority signal it has sent. And finally, Mr. Chairman, the UN. There is the key leverage point. I've set it out in a memo that I've distributed that I hope will be part of the record, and it was also set out in a remarkable letter sent by Senator Brownback and Congressman Wolf to former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. All refugees, as everybody has said, are migrants because they are persecuted on their return. You don't need to know anything else. The UN has the right to access those refugees the second they cross the Tuan River, and the obligation to insist upon it. But as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, there is Article 14 of the China-UNHCR Treaty, which is a powerful tool that I call on this commission and everybody who cares to begin exploiting. That's true of the South Koreans who are protesting against China. They ought to be protesting to Ban Ki-moon, himself a Korean, because the UN has the ability to change the whole ballgame. And let me just state, Section 14 of the treaty says that any dispute between the government of China and the UNHCR arising out of or relating to this agreement dealing with refugees shall be settled amicably or by negotiation or other mode of settlement. But if this fails, such a dispute shall be submitted to arbitration at the request of either party. And Suzanne Schulte for whom I have the most profound respect, said that some other country needs to negotiate it. That's not even accurate in that regard. The UNHCR can do it. And here's the last sentence. If within 30 days of the request for arbitration, neither party has appointed an arbitrator, and we're talking about China here, either party may request the President of the International Court of Justice to appoint an arbitrator. The arbitral award shall contain a statement of the reasons on which it is based and shall be accepted by the parties as the final adjudication of this dispute. Imagine the price China would have to pay if they were getting sued by the UN. And let me say, Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, that the North Korea Human Rights Act is explicit. It said that the failure of the UN to bring that arbitration proceeding provided under Article 14 of the treaty was, and I quote, an abdication by the UNHCR of one of its core responsibilities. Now, Mr. Chairman, we finance the UN and the UNHCR. China doesn't put any money in. We do. It's time we got our money's worth. It's time we really protected the lives of those 33 and the others, and we have the means to do it. And I'm hopeful that this commission, and frankly, members of the Appropriations Committee, who provide that support for the United Nations and for the UNHCR, will call in the High Commissioner, will call in Ban Ki-moon, will call their colleagues in the South Korean National Assembly, and begin putting the heat on the United Nations to stop being passive and, frankly, stop appeasing China and begin enforcing their treaty obligations and responsibilities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for
Thank you
permitting
very
me
much,
to testify.
Mr. Horowitz, for your testimony and very valid and I think very effective recommendations as to what all of us should be doing, including this commission. I want to thank all three of you for reminding us that whatever the intent was originally for leaving North Korea, as Ms. Han pointed out, her husband went across the Tumen River to bring back a sack of rice, and for that, because his family was starving, and for that he was imprisoned and killed, and then they became marked persons themselves. You know, it is what you are going to be forcibly repatriated to that dictates whether or not you're a refugee. And I think for some to miss that very obvious point needs to be underscored, and all three of you pointed that out, that whatever the original intent, if they go back, they're marked people, they have a huge target on their backs, and they either go to execution or to a hideous torture that awaits them. So thank you for reminding us of that in all three of you. Let me just ask, again, you heard